Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from 808 State, Transmission Suite. Well, here we are. The 7th 808 State album. The first new 808 State album in 17 years. This is a thing that happened. I am kind of at a loss for words. I suppose for those of you who haven't been following my channel for very long or don't know who 808 State are, allow me to introduce them. Right now, this is the duo of Graham Massey and Andy Barker, though in the beginning it started out with the former Martin Price and Gerald Simpson, aka a guy called Gerald. And for a while, Darren Partington was a member of the group, but he is no longer, but whatever. And may as well cut to the chase and say, not only is 808 State one of the most influential outfits in all of electronic music, having basically invented the 90s with their pioneering acid house work and seminal sophomore album 90, which was predictive of so many sounds and aesthetics throughout the 90s UK electronica scene and elsewhere. But even removed from the historical context, 808 State is probably in my top 10 all-time favorite bands. They were one of the first bands I ever discovered by myself while clicking through the iTunes store as a little middle schooler and discovering some of their classic tracks like Pacific 707 and Cubic and others. And I was pretty quickly hooked on pretty much all their stuff, and they've remained favorites to this day. I even did a full-on discography review of all their stuff a few years back. If you want more detailed thoughts on their previous 6 albums, you can check the link in the description, but for now, I'll just quickly go down their discography so far. This debut album from 1988 is the album that brought acid house to the UK. Most of the electronic music landscape as we know it would not be a thing without it. It's even a personal favorite and inspiration for Aphex Twin and Outtaker. Admittedly, my personal least favorite of their albums, as there's no nostalgia factor for me here. Didn't get to hear it till I was in college thanks to lack of availability. Bit simplistic for me too and really short. But I cannot deny the incredible historical impact this thing had, and the old school acid grooves are still really solid. Okay, this is where things really start to get interesting though. As I mentioned before, this album was predictive of so many different sounds in 90s rave and house music and plenty other genres, but more than anything it's just a goofy, oddball record with tracks that zigzag all over the place and jump from hook to hook, and it's just a ton of fun from start to finish. If you've never heard any album of theirs before, I'd most highly recommend starting here. This album moves a little more towards their poppier and more commercial side, but it is still absolutely off the wall. Still delivers all the core appeal that 90 had, but with more hooks and more tunes that could easily stick in your head, despite never sticking to the point. Oh, and it's got 2 Bjork features and a Bernard Sumner feature. Definitely check it out. Okay, this album, not quite as ahead of its time as the other ones. It's excessively drowning in 90s cliches and even more commercial than XL, but it is so incredibly fun and addicting and a constant reminder of why these styles were big at the time. Its relaxing moments work, its crazy moments work, everything about this album just freaking works. It's just obviously not timeless. This album is a 10 out of 10 for me. I do not make that statement lightly. This album is somehow their weirdest and most off-the-wall album of them all. To the point of even turning off many fans, sacrificed a fair bit of their accessibility as well, and yeah, it's not nearly as good as that near-perfect streak they had from 90 through Don Solaris. Pretty inconsistent. But there's so many wild, crazy, imaginative ideas here, and a feel to it that's unlike any other album I've ever heard. I've described it as being like an evil stir-fry restaurant that wants to kill you. Definitely a lot of great stuff to be found here. Which brings us to here. Outpost Transmission came out in 2002, and they'd pretty much gone completely quiet this whole time. Well, as far as new releases are concerned. They'd still toured and stuff, and put out archive compilations occasionally, but you know what I mean. The idea of a new 808 State album in 2019, this long after their peak of relevance or after any new music at all, what would that even sound like? Well, actually, I kind of had a smidge of a feeling I knew what it'd be like even before talks of a comeback even surfaced. Because, you know, I may know them for their goofiness, quirky stylings, non-linear song structures, and super consistently memorable hooks. Their game-changing place in history was only a bonus I discovered later, but it is those first two albums, New Build and 90, that I think they're most well remembered for these days. So I figured at this point, they'd most likely be trying to recapture the appeal of their earliest work. And that did, in fact, appear to be the direction they were going in when they first dropped the teaser EP to this album, Initial Granada Report. I did a mini review of that EP, I said I really liked it at the time, and I skipped over their second teaser EP, Subsequent Granada Report, hoping to avoid spoilers, but if you want my thoughts on those, both EPs had 2 tracks that made this album, 1 track that should have made this album but didn't, and a 4th track that didn't make the album, and it's probably for the best that it didn't. Initial Granada Report had their first big comeback single, Tokyo Tokyo, which I thought was cool but didn't love, as well as the pretty solid Ujala, which I liked more, and those 2 made this album. But they left off the fairly middling Planetin, and unfortunately, also the EP's showstopper banger finale, Battaglia. That was easily the best track on the EP, and it would have been the biggest highlights on this album had it been included. Missed opportunity there, if you ask me. And Subsequent Granada Report was admittedly a much weaker EP. Like, the tracks that made it onto the album were the decent enough The Ludwig Question, and the stranger and more memorable Cannonball Waltz. And it left off the entirely forgettable Marconi. That track, if it were on the album, would have been completely redundant. And the surprisingly energetic, melodic, and catchy Spiral Arms, a track that felt like it was bringing back some of those old kooky XL vibes with more of a retro 808 flair. Also would have been great to have on this album, but oh well, we got what we got. And what we got on the album proper, as you might guess, is unabashedly retro all the way through. Going somewhere from around the New Build era, and those sounds and styles, lots of old school TB303 acid synths everywhere, lots of TR-808 percussion everywhere, because of course. But by the same token, it's worth noting that this album is not New Build. Made up of a lot of similar ingredients, sure, but they go about it with an entirely different ethos. Let's not forget that New Build came from a time when the 808 and 303 weren't completely worn into the ground. That album sounds like a bunch of dudes having fun with this equipment that nobody was really playing with at the time. Even if they wanted to, you couldn't just make New Build again in 2019 and expect things to be the same in a world where the TR-808 is freaking everywhere and the TB-303 is somewhat of a relic of the past. And I think they kind of play into this fact just looking at the album's packaging or the music video for Tokyo Tokyo. It's covered in all manner of dated technology, a security room covered in CRT monitors, heaps of wires everywhere, walls and walls of old analog gear. It looks like something from a bygone era, and on this album they fittingly are specifically going out of their way to sound dated. Almost every synth texture is super fat and abrasive, the drum machines sound super mechanical, call attention to there being drum machines. Everything is very deliberately unpolished. Kinda like the textures on New Build, but with more of an air of, like, foreboding mystery to it, I suppose. It's much stiffer, it's much more sterile. This is an album that's trying to sound a lot older than it really is, and it definitely pulls that aesthetic off. If I were given this album blindly and told to guess the year it came out, I don't know if I'd say anything later than 1991. Though there is, of course, the question of how good this stuff actually is, and the answer is, yeah, it's pretty good. I do like this album a fair bit, but I think I would be lying if I said I loved it or thought it was great. I won't beat around the bush. The main reason I'm not head over heels for this thing is that I feel like it's a bit too stiff and serious for my liking. And it's not even that stiff and serious. It's still 808 State. But as a kid, I was always drawn to these guys for how goofy and cheesy they were. Like, they were just doing whatever the hell they wanted and never took themselves all that seriously, and you could tell in every second of their music that they were just having a good time. But this album's a lot more minimal and more meticulous than any of their other stuff. As I said, it feels very sterile, focusing almost entirely on this old technology with very little human presence. Kind of more like an early Audica record. It feels so scientific in its approach, and while it's cool and all, I can respect the new direction. it's never been what I look to these guys for. And even though it's a new direction for them, it's not like this is unlike anything I've ever heard before either. It's kind of like old school IDM-ish. But I do still probably hold this above New Build. Thing about that album is, divorced from historical context, as solid as all of those grooves are, and despite that album definitely being more danceable than this one, every track on there is super repetitive. None of them develop much beyond their initial groove, and one of the things I most loved about 808 State's other stuff was how a lot of their stuff kept wildly switching up and changing into something new. Not to mention, there's only 7 tracks on that album and it's over super quick. This album is not only way better fleshed out and paced, it feels much more complete just structurally. None of these tracks overstay their welcome, and most of them do evolve and change up a fair bit in the ways I'd hope for out of them. But I will admit, Transmission Suite is not exactly a front-to-back masterpiece where every track leaves a strong impression either. While there's nothing here that didn't at least have something to enjoy or feel so intrusive or redundant that I'd want it removed entirely, there are a couple of dull tracks here and there. Probably the lowest point for me was the track Huronic. Sure, it's perfectly competent and inoffensive and good for what it is, has cool melodies, certainly not a track I feel the urge to hit the skip button on, but it's just bland, artificial intelligence style IDM that doesn't grab my attention, and it feels like any producer from the early 90s could have made it. I shouldn't be able to mistake 808 State for, I don't know, B12. Also wasn't really huge on Landau. That one at least had some more intentionally off-putting flavors and some off-kilter bass lines and textures. But again, it wasn't really grabbing me more than any of these other tracks, and kind of just brought my mood down. And there are other tracks that, while all cool, I don't really have much to say about. Carbonade hits pretty hard, but doesn't have any textures that really stick out from the mix. Same with Angle Argle. I did enjoy that one a fair bit more. Heck, it was probably one of my favorites on first listen, but it hasn't stuck around as much as I keep coming back for repeat visits. The Ludwig question still isn't a huge highlight either, just decent to me, but I do really like the progression it goes on, how it switches up from sample to sample, and how that one voice switches languages and stuff. It's at least interesting. And the closer, Crab Claw, I go back and forth with that one much in the same way I did with Outpost Transmission's ending, Long Orange Testa. It works pretty well as one of the most abrasive and hard-hitting tracks in the bunch. All these synths are super loud and grating in a good way. Really solid and fun track, though I'm not totally sure if it's the most effective ending you could have picked. It's not the worst pick either. Unlike Long Orange, it's not the kind of ending that catches me off guard and makes me think, wait, it's over already? But neither is it exactly a climactic or satisfying finish like Sunrise or Olympic, or a crazy left hook like Sexy Synthesizer or Banachek. As an ending, Crab Claw is just kind of there, and that's about it. But yeah, those are the low points on this album, and even with all that in mind, I had positive things to say about all of them. This album isn't going to be like that last M83 album where it felt like wasted potential due to being overstuffed with redundant tracks. This album is staying on my iPod the way it is. So let's get into the good stuff now. First of all, after enough repeat listens, I made a full turnaround on Tokyo Tokyo. Definitely feels like the best tone setter and opener you could have picked for this thing. The acid grooves are pretty great, and while the vocal sample isn't fantastic, it is at least memorable and sticks in the head. Pretty solid opener, and they kept me invested with the chaotic but melodic rushes of Skylon and the offbeat fun of Cannonball Waltz. Skylon in particular is just an excellent track, and let me know that yeah, even with these more simplistic retro flavors, these guys still got it as far as hooks are concerned. Both of those are definite favorites. Also, Westland was pretty awesome. At first that one was just really offbeat and silly sounding, but it has this incredible build-up with all these super hard-hitting synth stabs that just smash through everything, and while it kind of just sticks to one groove after that, this is a track that despite all the retro flavors I'd easily be able to recognize as 808 State. That one made me happy. And the back half has lots of highlights too. I already talked about Ujala when that teaser EP drops, but it's only grown on me with all its I almost said erotic. With all its semi-exotic percussion and various progressions, a track that just goes all over the place but still sticks in your head like the best 808 State tracks do. Also really like Pulcenta, mainly because of that weird off-tune harmonica. It's just such an off-putting and strange addition that I couldn't help but love. And the subtle little xylophones certainly don't hurt either. Their weird sense of humor is still intact. I wasn't sure I liked Bushy when I first heard it. Initially found those weird fart-sounding synth leads in the beginning to be kind of annoying. But this was a major grower. A lot of great spooky side tracks in that one, and they have a lot of fun with it. And 1313 was a consistent favorite too because of how much that one changes up and remains interesting the whole time. So many weird and offbeat sections of that one, it feels totally unhinged in many parts. And you know, I've heard people say they thought the second half of this album was stronger than the first. I think they're about equal. But I suppose it all depends on which half you would place the 8th track, Trinity, because I think most of us can agree that is probably the best track in the bunch. This track almost makes up for the lack of Battaglia in that it hits almost just as hard with plenty of great crunching melodic hooks and fast-paced bass lines along the way. It is so much fun and sounds absolutely incredible. So overall, yeah, there's a lot of great stuff all over the place. It's certainly not just your everyday IDM album. It has plenty of time for all the oddball twists and turns that you'd want out of an 808 State project. The high points are still really something else. It's still a really good album. But I do hold this band to a ridiculously high standard, and as interesting and fun as this album is, most of their other albums are more interesting and fun than this. Even Outpost Transmission, while arguably has more low points and lower points than this album does, and is also really all over the place, that still had a feel to it that you couldn't get anywhere else or mistake for any other band or artist. Transmission Suite is plenty quirky and strange for the style it operates in, but I could tell they were really holding back on this one and restraining themselves from going too off the rails. Which was a bit of a letdown for me, because going off the rails is one of the things I feel they do best, and one of the things I most love when they do. So for that, this is probably one of my least favorite albums of theirs to date, which isn't saying much since I love all their other albums. This one I just really like, but I'm still open to this clicking more for me in the future. It's still a solid project that does not tarnish their legacy. Still got the CD coming in the mail, and I think I can still generally give it my thumbs up. I think I'll say Transmission Suite is a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.